Scriptures that Karin has chosen today start with Isaiah, the first chapter. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. And from the New Testament, James, again, chapter 1, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And finally, from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 18, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of my Father who is in heaven." Here ends the readings.
Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me well? Okay. First, I want to thank Suzanne Volsky, whose love of and respect for children has been a blessing to this church and its children, and to the community of Arvada for the past 2 decades that she has served on the Christian Ed Board. By the way, this is a good time for a plug for the Christian Ed Board. We have a lot of fun. It's a good time. We kind of all circle around something very important to us. So I'd like to open my remarks on this Children's Sabbath with a story that I told this congregation a few years ago. Trouble with good stories is you can remember them, right? And so I have to repeat myself. In such a heartrending year as 2020, when families and children are experiencing so much uncertainty and stress over health, safety, finances, jobs, childcare, and now even the immense responsibility of educating their own children while still being expected to go out and earn a living. These words have a new and even more powerful resonance. In a speech to a school conference in his country, the then British Secretary of State for Education said that perhaps one of the most powerful lessons from abroad for him had come from Kenya and the Maasai people who lived there. He said, whenever one Maasai greets another, they ask a question. Kasarian Ingera, not how do you do or how's it going, but how are the children? How are the children? It's wonderfully revealing about the values of Maasai society. Their first concern is for the next generation. And the hope for reply is equally revealing. All the children are well. Not my children, not some of the children. All the children are well. For the Maasai society cannot be well unless all the children are well. The question that Maasai ask each other is revealing not just of their society, but of ours. Whatever tests we set ourselves and whatever achievements we boast of, the question that goes to the heart of the health of our society should be the same. How are the children? Now, some have questioned whether this take on Maasai people is entirely factual or partly fable, but hey, we Christians are used to that, aren't we? The myths and the stories that permeate our Gospels. Whether it is more typical for the Maasai to use the standard greeting sopa, the equivalent of saying hello in English, or the merciful question, Kasarian Ngera, how are the children? Shows that it is a top priority, that the well-being of the most defenseless and powerless is the proper function of any good society. It is not just our concern for our nuclear families, but for our neighbors' families and our nation's families and the children all around the globe. There are so many ways to describe the blessings that children bring to this earth? Innocence, wonder, awe, abundant joy, boundless curiosity, unhesitating love, simple honesty of heart. But there's probably no more profound way to express it than the way Jesus answered the disciples' question, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he took a child upon his knee and declared, "Unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." There is something so precious in the childlike way of approaching the world that without it, you are lost even to the world of the spirit. Well, as I prepared my thoughts for this morning and read many Bible texts, and there are many on this subject, one quality of the child quickly came to the forefront: vulnerability. The Bible calls us to care for the most vulnerable among us, whether this is described as the widow, the weak, the poor, the fatherless, the orphan, the sojourner, the hungry, the homeless, the crippled, the lame, the blind, the afflicted, the oppressed, the sick, all throughout. Those are all ways to imagine the face of vulnerability. Vulnerable. The word comes from the Latin noun vulnus, or wound, which leads to the Latin verb vulnare, which means to wound, and then to the Latin adjective vulnerabilis, or vulnerable. The vulnerable ones, vulnerabilis ones, are the wounded ones. Well, it makes ethical sense to most of us to show compassion for and extend charity to the vulnerable ones among us, as Scripture suggests over and over again. But perhaps it's not as easy to see vulnerability as a worthy quality essential to our spirit, or an experience necessary to finding true wisdom. Let me say that line one more time. Perhaps it's not as easy to see vulnerability as a worthy quality essential to our spirit, or an experience necessary to finding true wisdom. Perhaps it doesn't make emotional sense to us to revere vulnerability as being blessed. And yet that's just how Jesus saw it. Blessed are the poor, the persecuted, the meek, those who mourn. Why is this, do you think? Why is it blessed to be wounded? Doesn't it seem strange in a world where we try so hard to be perfect and to hide our imperfection, to be respected, to be educated, to be flawless, to rise to the top, to win, to be healthy, wealthy, and wise? How about this? Imagine a person who does not recognize his or her own woundedness or vulnerability. A person unaware of personal flaws, unable to feel gratitude for the aid given by others, unable to respect the wisdom and guidance of others, or to appreciate the service afforded him by others. This person could, and usually does, and we have plenty of examples, become quite monstrous without the necessary humility of his humanity, his vulness, his woundedness. Facing our own wounds is the task that each of us have been given to wrestle with and to transform in our short time here on earth. I got to say that again. I hate to keep quoting myself, but facing our own wounds is the task that each of us have been given to wrestle with and to transform in our short time here on this earth. We must recognize our darkness and our hurt in order to find light and healing. We must not only acknowledge and accept our own wounds, but we must come to value them, to share them, to use them humbly and with sensitivity and compassion, connecting more deeply to others and serving the world around us. I always wondered about our wonderful John Cook. Some of you remember. Went through 19 surgeries. He was a chaplain at the Tennyson Center. He went through a lot of pain, and I don't know, but I can just hear his voice and see his face and want to thank God for that kind of love and that kind of spirit. But back to the children. They enter the world undefended, not yet awake to the discord of the world around them. They are simply who they are until they encounter the life-defying forces that emerge in this life around them: betrayal and abuse, neglect, fear, violence, racism, hunger. We are called by God to be their defenders, to protect their childhood, their bodies, their minds, and their souls and spirits. The Children's Defense Fund, in their 2020 report, articulates what many of us already know, that the nation's children are suffering. Persistent hunger, day after day, hope-draining hunger, affects the lives of 8.3 million American children. Deep poverty, the humiliation and pains of abiding need, haunt the lives of 7.1 million children in our rich nation. Gunfire violence, suicides, accidents, and homicides take the lives of 7 children a day. Marian Wright Edelman, an American author and activist for children's rights, has been an advocate for the disadvantaged Americans for her entire professional life. She's the founder of this organization and president emeritus of Children's Defense Fund, and the recipient of many awards, such as the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But the Christian worship resources for 2020 from this Children's Defense Fund call us as people of faith to take action rather than to give up in despair. While recognizing our failures as a nation, it reminds us how the power of God in our lives can give us the necessary courage and hope for change. This is how they say it, and I really found it helpful verbiage. As God exposes the failures of our society, our trust in God allows us to use the tools of truth and justice to act as agents of restoration. Much of the violence in our own day is targeted at children. Our nation allows millions of children to be hungry, homeless, uninsured, abused, and at high risk for violent death. Some will respond to these facts with apathy or despair. We know a better way. As people of faith, we can dare to comprehend the scope of injustices our children face. We can look at that, folks, because we know that with God's help, we can address these injustices. We can bring about change and restoration. The Children's Sabbath is a good opportunity to reassess the needs of our children in our church, community, state, and nation. The lions of justice in our past century, Bishop Desmond Tutu, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, did not succumb to persecution or to powerful forces of injustice or to personal doubts. They were agents of transformation because they dared to be. The presence of God in their lives was unmistakable. Like them, we are actual human beings with a full range of strengths and weaknesses. And like them, we're called to be God's agents in this world. We don't need to be perfect. We need to be perfectly ready to act. We're called to participate in God's plan of compassionate restoration. God never forsakes us, and we need not forsake each other. Well, our own church and this congregation has a long history of supporting children and supporting our children at the church and children all around the nation and world, teaching and healing and fundraising and coaching and nurturing. Many of you, and remember, you're about to have to perform, so get ready. Many of you individually have worked for the welfare of children in your personal or professional lives. I'm thinking of several of you right now. As I wrote this, I thought, oh, and then this and this and this. I could just name, I know y'all, but I thought, I want you to know each other. Many of you individually have worked for this. Rather than me naming names and inadvertently leaving out much important work, I invite you now to risk vulnerability this morning and to humbly speak, but very briefly, about the work God gave you and is giving you to do with children. This is what people should know, is this is the force. You are the force that's gone out into this world, the force for good, the lasting, constant, never stopping force for good. So blessed. In closing, let us remember the powerful affirmation and challenge expressed by the parable of the talents by Jesus in Matthew 25, where Jesus spoke the words of the master, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will now set you over much." Amen.